good direction here, I think. So thanks for coming into the start of this series on the Incarnation. It's very fitting. This is what Christmas is about. It's not just about the gifts and all the busyness, and which can very much feel that way. We were just driving home yesterday and saw tons of Christmas trees on the roofs of cars and lights up already, and people didn't skip a beat, or they are already at it. So pressure is on. The way that this series is going to go, I'm kicking us off this morning, and a little bit about what I'm going to speak to, I hope, is the possibility of the Incarnation. Is it possible? And, clearly, that's my little buzzy, catch to start us, because yes, it is indeed possible. Well, what are the implications? What are the challenges? The kind of metaphysical and philosophical challenges, and what does that actually mean for us to be human if this indeed happened? And what does it mean for God to be God, and what does it mean for us to be the church? Not just because it happened, but what does it mean for what we do on Sunday mornings?
So you've set your bar kind of low. There's not
Set the bar really low. Yeah, full disclosure, I was just starting to read this really amazing book by Rowan Williams. He was the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Brilliant. It has to be one of the most brilliant minds of the 21st century, not just theologian. Just so brilliant. His book, Christ, the Heart of Creation. And this is kind of one of the topics that he tackled. It has taken me weeks and weeks and weeks to try to muddle my way through. So I'll try to give you some of that here. The next week, as Peter mentioned, we'll have Phil Carey coming from Eastern University. He's the head of the philosophy department and also the editor of a big philosophy periodical that goes out on a monthly basis as well. He's a fantastic speaker and brilliant guy. The following week, we'll have Joanne speaking to some of the theology of the Incarnation as expressed in the hymns or anthems that we sing at the Lessons and Carol service, which will be that same evening. So maybe a little bit of a primer for some of you if you come in the morning and then go back in the evening. And then Peter will kind of try to bring it all back together. He hasn't quite told me yet what he'll be speaking to, but mark your calendar, it'll be good. So, any time that I think we start talking about issues of theology, it can feel very dry. It can we ask the question maybe like, why are we talking about this? That was my initial reaction in grad school when I was at Villanova to start. I said, why are we talking about this stuff? God is who God is going to be. I'm who I'm going to be. What does it matter? One of my seminary professors said it well. She said, theology is the intellect of prayer. And I think it's a beautiful way to think about it. That even our study of God, this kind of ascent to try to ponder and wonder who he might be or she might be or who this God is, draws us deeper into the life of God and can even be a prayerful endeavor. These things are worth thinking about simply because they deepen our spiritual life and help us stand before God in a different kind of posture. So that is my hope of why this might be a worthy endeavor. I'm going to ask that you all participate a bit this morning. I have a number of questions that I want to get us together, and I'm going to try to synthesize some of these things and put us in a space where we can try to address some of the challenges of the Incarnation. Right off the bat, can someone just try to tell me in a few words what is the Incarnation? I know that seems like it's not a trick question.
So not just the birth, you're saying the miraculous birth of Christ. Right? More than that.
So it's, that's right. On Christmas we say that Christ came down and that God came to walk among us on the earth, right? That's kind of the beginning of this story, perhaps. But we might even say that the Incarnation is the whole scope of Christ's teaching and his life and his work and everything that he did on the cross. The whole of his person, not just the teachings. And this is something that I'll raise in a moment, is it's fascinating. I think we can often think of Christ as Christ the teacher, right? He has a collection of sayings, parables that we hear on Sunday mornings frequently, and they're often delivered to us in this kind of way. Here's a teaching, here's a parable I'm going to offer, and let's just unpack and try to think what it means. But Christ was more than just a teacher. Clearly, if we say that Christ was the Son of God, he was more than a teacher. But to only get caught in the weeds here and say that he was only a teacher doesn't take full account for his God's infinite presence in a finite reality. It's kind of absurd, really, if we think about it, and hopefully where I'm going to get to by the end of this is talking about some of the implications for the church. One of the major implications for this is, we experience incarnational kind of metaphysics every Sunday morning at the Eucharist. We say that somehow God is coming back into this world, very present right here in this one space, and yet not destroying the elements that he is present in. That somehow God and something of creation can coexist in one space, it should be astounding. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons to say that this is an impossibility, and I think perhaps rightfully so. Let me backpedal a moment here. All this talk about the Incarnation falls under a field of theology that we might call Christology. It is the study of Christ. Very fitting. Makes sense. There are a number of issues that arise when we talk about the person of Christ and his experience and our witness of him in the Gospels. Can anyone think of any things that are particularly hard to believe of Christ, or upsetting, confusing, that don't really make sense, perhaps? And I could just start with one of them. If God is fully present in Christ, does he have full knowledge of reality? Does he have full knowledge that he is going to end up on the cross one day? Does he have full knowledge of all of the behavior of his disciples? Any reactions to that? What do you all think? I mean, this is and this is part of this endeavor of talking about this. There's no clear answer, perhaps. This is part of what Rowan Williams calls sort of the rhythm of the life of Christ. There's to land fully in one camp on a far extreme or the other doesn't do justice to this person who is both God and man. That we're constantly in this tension of rhythm that should be unresolved. And so it's worthy to speak of and think about these issues. We say in one of the things in the 39 articles, which is in the back of the Book of Common Prayer, it's now just labeled a historical document. It was formerly part of church teaching. But there's something that says that Christ was like man in every way, but without sin. And that seems like an important distinction, right? That in some way there was, however we want to categorize that Christ was without sin, which has huge implications for us. That Christ somehow becomes an example for us of right behavior before God, but more so even than that, because we recall that sin isn't just improper behavior. That's sort of and I don't want to be Catholic bashing here, of course, but we're not keeping a ledger of our sins before God and somehow weighing our merits before him. Sin is a much larger reality than that. Sin is the sort of distance between creation and creator. It's the chasm that Christ comes into the world to sort of bridge. That no longer is there a distance between God and man, because Christ, theologian St. Augustine says that once the king comes to dwell amongst the city, all are ennobled with him. That all of us are raised to this sort of status of what we can be before God. Reactions. I don't want to keep going until... I don't want to just keep speaking, because I can just keep going and going in all sorts of directions. Nothing yet?
We're with you.
What do you think of what are the main thoughts that come to your mind when you prepare for the Christmas season? Groaning. Anything? Yeah.
Michael, just a brief comment on
on your maturity that you just left.
Yes.
When I do think of God as a human and without sin,
Mm-hmm.
I find that extraordinary.
Yeah.
Any attempt by us, by me, goes away immediately as far as no sin. That's all. It's just a comment on that whole
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. That's a great comment. I don't know. I'll go back to that. Yeah, Bob.
I was just thinking, Christ was both divine and human.
Mm-hmm.
And where do you draw the line between? Is I think the essence of Christ. He, when he was interacting as a human, he was a human and thinking as a human. His Father was in heaven. Okay, he wasn't the Father then when he was part human, but he was always aware of God, and that was the divine side of Christ. That's the way I think of it.
You are wrestling with the right questions and challenges here. This is what the early church spent centuries trying to figure out here. How can sort of this divine tag team kind of thing, where is Christ? Where is he actually? If he is here on earth with us, where is the divine aspect of the Trinity? What we might call the Word, the divine Word, the capital W word, we see it in John 1. Where is that located when Christ is here on earth? And are those two things somehow separate? And this is a big question too, is we say that Christ is both fully human and divine without confusion. So that those two things aren't somehow, they're not mixed. They're separate aspects of him, yet somehow united. That this is part of the mystery of the Incarnation as well. It's unresolvable. Mike.
I also think about his growing up, family.
Yep.
And there are references, I understand, in the Bible refer to his brothers and sisters, and I know different denominations interpret that differently, but he was the oldest in a family, supposedly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how could, I mean, he had to have been a little bit devilish at times.
That's where I thought you were going, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
That's part of being human, and yet, how could that, that's difficult, how could he have been perfect as a kid, if he was truly human? Anyway, I know the Roman Catholic Church just glosses over that family thing because they think of the perfect family as being, God, Mary, and Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
There really is
Yeah, there's a sort of maintenance of the
Yeah.
purity of Mary
Yeah.
as well involved with that.
She couldn't possibly have had it.
Yeah, right.
Children any other way other than through God. But don't the scriptures actually say differently?
Sure, yeah, there's reference to say his brothers and sisters, his siblings, and I think the Catholic Church would read that and say those are kind of, as Paul would say, were brothers and sisters in Christ in the early church, and
Right.
a reasonable read, I think. Yeah. But to your first point here, wasn't Christ a little devilish as a child? I mean, we have an account of him being lost in the temple and sort of scolding his own mother and saying, "Didn't you know that I was supposed to stay here in my father's house?" And then when she approaches him at the wedding at Cana, and says, "Can you do something? Get us more wine?" She says, "Woman, why are you coming to me?" Referring not even to his mother. Yeah, he's a little bit snarky, right? I mean, that's. I think that's right on. Yeah. But it raises an issue, right? I mean, this is what theologians think about. Because when we talk about sin, they say even ignorance is a kind of sin. So Christ not knowing, having this full knowledge of being a child, how can that be compatible with the one who is God from the moment of birth?
Right.
It's how do you resolve that tension? Just as a response to that is some theologians just say, well, he still had to mature and grow as a human being. that he had to grow to this kind of full stature of knowledge that we go through, our brain developing through adolescence and all of that process, and there is I think evidence of that in the gospel as well, where God, especially at moments like where John the Baptist baptizes Christ, and during the Transfiguration, all these moments where somehow Christ is maybe given a glimpse through grace of who he is, who he's called to be, and perhaps what his ultimate reality is. There's almost something hidden even to him in the life of God, but it creates a great challenge, because we would say that is an aspect of sin, right? I mean, even Christ throwing tables in the temple when he was pretty upset. I mean, what do we make of that? The one who is without sin is yeah, absolutely. Right. Back to my question. What do we think about during the Christmas season? What are the first things that come to mind? Both pleasing, upsetting, the things that causes groans in the back of the room. And
I think one thing is the separation between the religious aspect of it, the church aspect of it, and the mall. It's just these two huge events happening all mixed together and pulling us apart, and pulling us in different directions.
Yeah, for sure.
Think of family, think of memories, usually of people no longer with us. Think of it's a little bit more prolonged, so it's sort of like, okay, get ready. So back to our point about sort of the separation. What are you getting ready for? Are you getting ready for Advent and the coming of Christ, or are you getting ready for decorating the house and the parties and the singing the hymns and all that? Buying gifts.
Any other thoughts? It's true. I mean, those are some of the tensions, right? It's where are we being pulled? It's right from this Sunday onwards. It's we're already hearing Christmas hymns on the radio, or not even hymns. We're hearing. Excuse me. Got a little. That's right. We're hearing our carols on the radio. The mall was decorated 2 weeks ago, at least. 3 weeks ago.
Of course, we all know this season is not the Christmas season, but this is Advent.
Right.
And Christmas doesn't come till Christmas Day.
Right.
But most people after Christmas just, put their trees out on the road and,
Yeah.
and really it should be celebrated. It's not answering your question, but it comes to mind.
No, it's right though. Yeah, right. We're in the Advent season. It's not Christmas yet. The 12 days of Christmas are the 25th through January 6th, when we conclude on Epiphany, and that brings us into the new calendar year. It's right.
Tree's pretty dry by then.
Tree's pretty dry by then, right? That's right.
Freezing to get out of the house,
So there are competing visions of what is going on during this season, and I think that maybe even speaks a little bit to kind of the implications of what it means for God to be with us as well, because it's a daily reality. It's not a Christmas Eve celebration in the church, and lo and behold, here we are, and we have our candles and our lights, and it is a kind of a celebration of light amidst darkness. That's right, but Christ coming into the world transforms reality. And so my question to you all, and I will have 3 of these each, is and again, no wrong answers here. If Christ really came into the world as God, what does that tell you about God?
He's a good sport.
He's a good sport. He's a good sport, right?
Loving.
He's loving. Yeah.
Forgiving.
Giving.
He was giving something to man, a gift.
Yeah. I'm gonna keep. Anything else?
For some reason, he wasn't in the world before, so we wouldn't answer that one.
Yeah.
Creator. Before.
showing us a way to heaven.
Show us a way. Hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts? This is some good stuff to work with here. So let's start with the idea that that God is a creator. That's right. And I've read a number of great theologians who said, really, then the incarnation is kind of the I preached a sermon on this before. C.S. Lewis says it. The eucatastrophe of creation. It is the surprise, catastrophic event that is meant for the good of all people. That this is this inbreaking in the world. And Rowan Williams would even go so far to say that even if man had not abandoned God, this kind of mythical idea of the fall, even if that had not occurred, that the incarnation still would have happened. That the incarnation was the completion of the act of creation. It was the bridge of God, the creator, somehow being permeated in all of creation. That gap separating the creator from the creation was no longer. That those two things were bridged in one space. Which I think is a really fascinating idea. It's and it takes very seriously something that I think is more of a kind of like Anglican or Episcopal theology, is that we put a lot more emphasis actually on Christmas and the incarnation than we do on Easter in the church. Like, it may or may not seem that way, but I think a lot of Anglicans would actually say that the majority of the kind of redeeming work is actually done in the incarnation. That when God came to bridge this gap, like that was the moment. When Christ, and we said the word loving, that this is a loving God, that this is the sort of down payment on that love, that this is the sacrament even of this love, that here is God himself walking on the earth, living, breathing, suffering, and dying as one of us, that this is the full extension of God's compassion for us and with us. I think that this is maybe even another way to think about this is, even, it's a sort of this is wrapped up in the incarnation as well, this idea that the revelation of who God is in the world, that our clearest vision of who God is, and this is the claim of the Christian church, is that the clearest vision of who God is seen through Christ. And particularly is seen through someone who is self-dispossessing, who is self-offering and willing to give absolutely everything for the sake of the world. That these are things that, and here's the beauty of that John 1 text where we describe Christ as the Word, that there's certain things that we can't communicate in this world with words. Just language falls apart, the wheels fall off, and there's certain things we just can't express. But when God no longer just spoke to us, but actually came to us as Word and was created and altered the fabric of reality, we got a glimpse of this thing that our eyes and ears could not perceive otherwise, that it was right before us. The idea of where then was God before this? That's right. That should raise all sorts of questions about the Old Testament. We see God appearing in the burning bush. We see God speaking to the prophets like Jeremiah that we had this morning, leading the people of Israel into the promised land. God is very present. God is still very present in creation. But perhaps, and maybe this comparison works or does not, the Episcopal Church is an interesting church in that we do celebrate communion almost every Sunday. And yet it's a Protestant denomination. So there are folks who appreciate the Eucharist a little bit more than some others. If you have folks who maybe grew up in the Presbyterian Church, they're more excited about the liturgy of the Word, the sermon, and how they might be edified by that. More sacramental denominations like the Catholic Church, if you come to the Episcopal Church, you might be fed by the Eucharist by gathering at the table. And this raises, I think, a similar question. Where does God come to us in our worship? I mean,
The gospel, the reading of the gospel,
mhm.
paraphrasing God, and in the Eucharist, as you say,
Yeah,
breaking of the bread.
yeah.
I think it's where ritual comes in, which you can sometimes look at as negative and getting in the way, and sometimes as positive. If things like ritual and music and so forth are a place to be, a chink in the woodwork to transcendence of some sort.
I think it can be different things for different people. I think that
Mhm.
just community is an aspect of gathering together.
That's right.
I
Yeah.
would say that God is present in everything in the service,
Yeah.
Mhm.
including everything in daily life. So I have a much bigger view of spirituality. And, but coming together as a community helps reinforce and helps support that belief. And of course, having wonderful experts like yourself help us in that journey is why we're here. That's my personal view.
I appreciate that. All of the above, I think, is right. God comes to us in many and varied ways in life. And perhaps maybe the way to think about it is, depending on the person, depending on the time, depending on the prayers we raise, the needs of our hearts, God is more transparent to us in different ways at different times. For some, our musicians, perhaps it's the singing of hymns. For those who enjoy reading and listening and are more oral in their participation, it might be the liturgy of the word. It might be hearing the gospel spoken. For those who are more visual, maybe even some of our children, the sights, the sounds, the torches being lit, there's something sacred being offered here. God is indeed present in the whole of creation. I think if I were to make a distinction here, and I'll go back to this, this language is helpful for me at least. I think of the Incarnation. I think of Christ coming into the world as Jesus is the sacrament of God. And let me try to unpack that. If we think about what we do at the table every Sunday, we do believe something unique is going on there. We do say that in some way, somehow, that God is just a little bit more present, is localized in this space, at this time, with this community. And Julie, the idea of community is vital to the church, because ultimately what Christ did was establish a community where he is the head of the community, but all we do and pattern our lives of service to others, of gathering and being a community defined by love, that continues to do the revealing work of God in the world. That is the extension of the Incarnation. We continue to participate in that. When we gather around the table, we think about ritual, the ritual aspect of it. There are all sorts of components to it that make God a little bit more transparent to us, perhaps. I think some of it is, and some of it's inhibited right now because of COVID, I will say, but the idea that people who are strangers before they gathered in a space together can stand together, kneel together, shoulder to shoulder at the altar rail and receive God together as equals, tells us something, I think, about who God is and what the kingdom of God is like. I can't think of many other places in the world where that can happen, where people so very different, perhaps, can gather together and be made one before God. And God is transparent to us, I think, in that way. That was my tangent of trying to describe Christ as the sacrament. So I mean, when I think about that then and say that Christ is the sacrament, I go back to this point that all of who Christ was on earth tells us a little bit more about the God who created all things and who gave us everything. Not just his words to his disciples, not just the kind of snarky behavior in the temple. The whole of these things are somehow subsumed into this revelation of who God is to us, which culminates on this moment of on the cross. And a thing about that, I think I would say, is there are all sorts of beliefs about the cross and what's going on there. This kind of atoning work where God makes us one with him again through Christ's death and resurrection. I think, in the way I love to think more about it, is the cross really tells us, it affirms who God is and confirms who we are. Let me say that again. The cross affirms who God is and confirms who we are. We are a people who will abandon God no matter what. We will reject the absolute good, even when it's presented and given to us in full extension. And God is the one who, even on the cross, will not abandon us, will not deny us again, will not complain at that moment. This is the kind of completion of the Incarnation. This is the moment of which we know who we are and we know who God is. Reactions to that.
What do you think God was thinking before 2,000 years ago? Or, yeah.
What was God thinking?
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
what was the event
The same thing he's thinking now.
that caused him to send Jesus here?
What made it the time?
Yeah, what made it the time?
Oh, and this is good too, because I can use words
Yeah.
from Joanne's sermon today. The scriptures say that there are two kinds of time, and Joanne mentioned it this morning: chronos and kairos time. Chronos is kind of the chronological passing of time, moment by moment, ticking of the clock. The kairos sense of time is the sense of eternity. It's the scriptures, when you hear it, it says at the right time is usually how that's translated. It's knowledge outside of our purview, I think, in some ways. It's I'd like to think of it as, again, this kind of idea that Joanne said, where both past and present and future are all gathered together in one instance. That this is how God perceives the world. And so for us to have a view into when Christ would come is, I don't know, I kind of throw my hands up a little bit.
I think it's human reaction to try to put things in chronological order because we only experience time run forward.
Uh-huh.
If you think about it from the eyes of either modern science or even God, where if you could experience all things happening at once, it could make sense. But we can't do that for whatever reasons. We're limited by experiencing this direction. So it's senseless to us, but maybe as a whole it makes sense. That doesn't answer your question, but
Yeah, no, the image that I think that I have in my mind when I think about the way that perhaps God perceives the time that we perceive is a kind of a movie reel extended all the way on one direction, and God sees the whole reel all at once, where we only see a frame of it. And it's the story is all told in one instance for God, but for us, we're in the most present moment, all at once. But it's a great question. Why did Christ come at that moment? It's a wonderful, wonderful question. It comes in a long line of history of the Jewish people, of people who were abandoned, in many, many instances. But our Psalms and our Old Testament tell us that the one thing that kept bringing God back was God's loving kindness is often the word that's used. It's what did my Old Testament professor say? It was the thing that makes God come back to us, like despite us, essentially. That is God's very nature, is loving kindness. That's not even just a characteristic of God. God is loving kindness. It's total giving, total compassion. Yeah.
Michael, is there anything from an historical point of view, because I think that's what we're looking at, that happened, maybe it was the coming of the Roman Empire taking over Jerusalem and Judea. Was there any other kind of historical event that one might be tempted to link God's coming to?
I will say perhaps.
Merging of different communities, by the way.
And that's, yes, so the idea of the Roman Empire, I think it's a great place to begin, because it was really one of the first few times where such a large swath of the known world was speaking the same language. They were speaking Koine Greek. The Koine is just literally meaning communal. There was a language that actually most people in the Mediterranean knew that language and spoke it. So it had great implications for how even the gospel could spread, because people could speak it and understand the same language and the same tongue. That there was this moment, this precious moment, where perhaps the word could have been made known a little bit better. I think it's the idea to try to pinpoint a specific moment. It's a challenge because I think there are plenty of moments in history we could say, well, this is the most dire moment in which God ought to be here. Something that's really interesting, though, and I think the Gospel of Matthew sets it up well. There is King Herod is the one who is ruling at the time, and kind of totalitarian ruler, of course. And there's this really subtle mention, I think, in the gospel that I think is indicative of who God is, where it says that after the virgin birth, Joseph named the child. And that doesn't sound like much, but when a father named a child in the ancient world, especially in the Jewish tradition, it meant that was their child. That they were claiming that child. That is my offspring. The thing about that is, in that moment, Joseph was adopting Jesus. King Herod was adopted. So when we're talking about the gospel being good news, it's this subversive message. It's absolutely subversive. There's this kind of laying of one historical narrative that says, here's the world as it is, but here is how God is speaking a different reality. And it's subtle. As God often can be very subtle in our lives. Yeah. I think I'm getting...
I liked your description of the incarnation, not just the birth, but the whole life of Christ through the death on the cross, as being the completion of the creation, sort of the last chapter, meaning the great plan that he had, whatever, as you say, imagine the two schools and the whole film out in front of you. And so what we're asking is, why at this time, under these circumstances, with these humans, was this chosen to be the moment? That, answering predictions, right? There were predictions that there was going to be the coming of the Messiah, right? But perhaps not in the form and reality that it took.
Right, and that's there's a whole sort of religious cult behind the notion of Jesus coming, and not the cult kind of in a bad connotation, but I mean, we have cultic practices in the church, like that's just the word you would use. But the all of the sense of anticipation of the arrival of the Messiah who would flip the world upside down, that was the message of the Jewish people for centuries. Trying to think, after the second temple was destroyed, after the first temple was destroyed in like 586 BC, the whole nature of this kind of sense of waiting was changed. The thing again, though, about God being surprising and subversive, though, is all the idea of a Messiah coming were not who Jesus actually proved to be. Not ruling by power, not ruling by authority, ruling by subversion and meekness, self-giving, self-denial. That this is what power looks like. Power looks like giving up everything. And that's what Jesus preaches over and over and over and over again. Jesus spends more time in the Gospels talking about money than anything else, and about status and wealth. That is, if all the kind of sound bits you might see on the news about who Jesus actually is, like that's who his, that is his primary message, is this sense of being for other, creating a community that doesn't look like the communities of the world. And not at the exclusion of the world, but rather to somehow inform, to continue to be a living witness to who this God in the world is. This is what the Incarnation is and what it does to us.
Do you think that's one of the reasons the Jewish people had such trouble accepting him? Because he wasn't a political Messiah?
That's at least like what's portrayed in the Gospels for sure. I mean, that was the in a week span from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday, that is the triumph and the disappointment of the people. Was here's the king of the Jews gathering into the city who's going to overthrow those who oppress us, and lo and behold, he's not it, and we're going to kill him. It's the disappointment of a leader who doesn't lead by absolute power. Yeah.
So the Jews are still waiting for the Messiah, is that right? Is that what they still?
Supposedly.
Is that what they still teach? I mean, is that?
I need to figure out the precise language of that. I believe so, and I believe the kind of ultimate hope is that that at the coming of the Messiah, the temple walls will be restored as well. The temple that is still 95% rubble in Jerusalem. There's the one remaining western wall, but yeah, it's a waiting. We're all waiting. Is the thing. I mean, that's the we say we wait for Christ to come again. It's the world is still in a sort of place that is already but not yet. We know who this God is, and we know where our ultimate reality is, but yet we are still here, only getting glimpses of who that God is. Yeah. Any other kind of final questions or remarks? Yeah.
Were the Jews the only people having a relationship with one monolithic God? I'm wondering why he chose the Jews of all the world's people to bring Christ.
Yeah, and
they're the only people that were worshiping the God.
The Jewish people were certainly an outlier in that way of being a monolithic faith. It's actually really interesting. In some of the texts of the Old Testament, there's even an acknowledgement that there are other gods, and yet they are not the God of the Jewish people. So it's I can't remember the word for it, but it's essentially that this is the one God among many. It's what is it? I can't remember what it is. Anyway, but that doesn't even make any sense too, because if God is who God is, there's no gradation of godly power. It's here's God up here, and there's an absolute chasm between God and anything else. So it's a kind of fantastical idea of thinking about things. What was the initial question here? I'm trying to remember. I totally lost it.
No,
You're too young
Julie's
for that
question
to
was talking
happen.
about, were there other monotheistic religions, is what she was asking.
Yeah, and that's the other fascinating thing about this too, right? And this is why it's why the idea that Christ is God and man is such a scandal to the Jewish people too. It would have been intolerable. The primary prayer of the Jewish people was the Shema Israel. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, which is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. That was primary. There was this indivisible God that it must absolutely be one. So the idea that there could be a trinity of God, and we also are monotheistic, but the idea that somehow God could also be present here was scandalous, was heretical. And it kind of makes sense why he was so quickly rejected.
But they're expecting a Messiah to come.
We're expecting a Messiah, a different kind of Messiah. Not a Messiah who was God, a Messiah who was as the word just means, the anointed one, the one who would lead, who would be given a sort of kingly and priestly power to rule and to bring the Jewish people back into, gather them as a people and to give them a land and to cause them to lead, really, essentially, to be a chosen people for the world. And ultimately, and I think if I had to say why perhaps in a historical moment or at least to these people, the language of covenant is primary in the Old Testament. That God made a certain covenant with Abraham, with Moses, with David, that this covenant that the word literally means to you cut a covenant. So there's this idea that something is lost on both ends, that God has skin in the game with his people, Israel, that if something is going to happen to them, God will suffer also. And so that language is embedded in our understanding of who Christ is and how Christ cuts a covenant with us. We have all sorts of covenant language in our prayers every Sunday morning. Yeah. I went on a lot of different tangents.
That's good
Really
stuff.
interesting.
Anything else? No? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I encourage you to come back next week. Phil Carey is going to be a fantastic presenter for us. Really brilliant guy and just really well organized and engaging person. So please do come back. That also goes for you at home here. Thank you for joining us.